This is Parenting for the Everyday, a podcast dedicated to meeting parents in the trenches of parenthood. We explore how our faith fits into our parenting. With the help of our guests, we are seeking practical tips on how the gospel can speak into our day-to-day parenting. From the easy stuff to the hard stuff, we want to talk about it all.
This is Parenting for the Everyday. I'm Holly Dyke-Andrew.
And I'm Becca Alvarez. And today we have a tricky topic.
Yes.
We are talking about how to navigate peer pressure for our kids. And peer pressure is hard.
And everybody
in
walks
so many different levels. So luckily we have experts in our studio.
Did you guys know you were experts?
News to me.
News to me as well.
Congratulations. We have two wonderful employees for our high school ministry or our
Middle school,
kids ministry.
Yeah.
I'm going to let them introduce themselves though. So take it away.
Yeah. My name is Alyssa Mikeshock, and I work here at CCC on the middle school team.
And my name is Kanan Coffey, and I work here on the high school team.
Love it. So we've got a ride range. We're going all the way from 11 to 18.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
going to cover it all.
We're gonna cover it all. So I have obviously a kid right in the middle of that. So when I leave this, I expect to be able to handle all the peer pressure issues that come ahead. Okay. No, it's interesting because peer pressure comes in so many forms and affects kids at different ages and in different ways. And even as an adult, I feel like
I still get peer pressure.
yeah, like peer pressure. Like
That's
I
so
don't wanna do
real.
that, but everybody was doing it, so I felt like I had to.
Is this a bad
Yeah.
sign for me parenting my kids if I'm still a victim to peer pressure?
No. So let's start with all the way back, and then you guys can kind of do past and what you guys see through high school students, just whatever you guys want to share. So looking back, what do you think is the biggest source of peer pressure when you guys were growing up? And then maybe contrast, do we think it's the same for high school students now, middle school students, or has it changed? Like, let's start with that.
Yeah. All right, I'll start us off. So I think back to middle school me, and I'm like, the kids that I was friends with were my all in all. Like, if I did not have their approval, like, I was in shambles. And so I think it was 7th grade. I had started hanging out with the cool crowd, and like I took pride in the fact that like I was friends with these select girls, and like we would hang out and we were on the cheer team and we would dance together, like all the things. And so from a very young age, like the idea of peer pressure already came from something that like where I was searching my identity in my friends. And so that just heightened it for me. And so, yeah, 7th grade me was like my friends were my source of like peer pressure. And that's where gossip started, at the lunch table and injecting myself in conversations that I probably shouldn't have been part of or,
Wanting to be cool.
Yes,
yeah,
wanting to
keep
like
your status.
Yeah, dress a certain way. Like I had no desire to cheer, but because my friends were doing it, I was like, oh, I'll try out. Like I'll be on the cheer team with them. That's cool,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Totally.
I think the biggest word you said there is identity. And I think that's, when I've spoken to high school students this year, that's what I hit on the most is identity, because I experienced those same things, but as I was entering high school. And I think for me, a lot of it had to do with athletics. But yeah, a lot of it was my friends. A lot of my friends weren't believers, and those are the guys I was hanging out with all the time. And so even growing up in the church, I had a hard time figuring out, okay, what is my identity amongst all these guys who are my good friends? And I like doing the things they do, but how do I stand out as a believer, as a Christian? And so I think for me it was just my friends, the people I was around every day, and I think now it's the same, but now with the social media kick, like even 10 years since I've been out of high school, how much that has changed, and that was just introduced when I was in high school, but now it's just like taken over in a crazy way.
That's what I was going to ask, because I assume as being like the old lady in this room right now, like there wasn't really social media. I mean, it was like AIM and MySpace. That was cool.
I don't
back in the
even
day,
know what
okay?
that is.
Okay.
That's crazy.
That's offensive.
That's crazy.
But anyway.
You're actually uninvited for this podcast.
But anyway, I feel like, but now it's totally different. And so it sounds like as you guys were coming up, it was just like the beginnings of it, and now it's rampant. It's everywhere. So it's what everybody is doing. I don't even know that it's real, but they feel like this is what everybody is doing.
I've heard too, part of the thing that makes that so difficult and peer pressure so difficult is there's never any break. So even when we were growing up with AIM and you could still have contact with your friends after you left school, it's like you have to wait for them to get online. They got to do their dial up. Like it's going to take a minute for you to get connected again. Where now kids are connected all the time.
Yeah.
So if you are seeking your identity in something else at school and you come home and there's still like remnants of who you are, like that starts to get stoked up too, because you still have to be that person
Mm.
that you are at school, at home, and all these different places. So it's tough when you're putting your identity on friends or on
Yeah.
athletics or anything. Because that just starts to consume who you are. And we all know, I mean, I was that 7th grade girl too, that's like the most unstable identity you can pick.
Yeah.
You know, so you are on this roller coaster of whatever they want for your life. And it's so,
Mhm.
so tough. But when you're there, it just feels like that's everything.
Yeah, and it
Mhm.
feels like as parents, what we are doing here is combating that identity,
Yeah.
right? So I feel like we're having to say, no, that's not your identity. This is where your identity is. No, that's not your identity. This is where your identity is. It's like they have so much noise. And so we are trying to get our voice in there.
Yeah.
And you guys now are also trying to do that, like, from being on staff. So
Mhm.
let's go back again. If you could go back and you could give your younger self some advice about dealing with peer pressure, or maybe even the advice you're giving high school students, what do you say? That's kind of a loaded question, but
That is a tough one. I think initially what my mind comes to is similar to what we were just talking about, but the idea that when we try to be like everybody else and we try to fit in through peer pressure and we try to be like every other person, we think that's going to lead us to be more happy, more free, but in reality, like it brings a stronghold on us and
Yeah.
there's more weight on you. And, I remember periods in my life where I decided to give that up and just the freedom that comes with that by living in my identity and who God made me to be. And so that's what I would tell myself. I was like, look, God created you to be you, Cane and Coffee, and you alone. And I remember my parents always telling me that growing up, like, there's only one Cane and Coffee. And so I think that helped me realize, like, man, I don't need to be like everybody else because, like, I don't like who I am
Yeah.
when I'm trying to be like everybody else.
Yeah.
And so,
it doesn't make you happy.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really good. I was thinking about this morning. Like, what is at the root of peer pressure is like fear of man and like people operating out of fear of man. And like, because my identity wasn't secure in Christ, I was trying to find it in what others had thought of me. And so by doing that, by giving into peer pressure, I was rejecting who God was calling me to be. I was rejecting who God said that I was and trying to like almost come under my friends, like come under their leadership rather than the Lord's. And so I think like if I could go back and look at Alyssa, like similarly of what your parents were saying of like, you're the only Alyssa Mike Shock, like be the best you that you can be. Like don't do it for whoever. Don't try and look like whoever. Like you're meant to be Alyssa. And like God doesn't make mistakes when he creates
Yeah.
people. Like you don't have to come under a different label to fit in or be cool.
Yeah.
Like you are you, and that's so awesome.
I love that. And what an important truth for your parents to be kind of hammering into you. With you guys working with high school and middle school students, just from your perspective, what do you think that parents often misunderstand about the peer pressure that their kids are facing today?
Nothing. We're perfect.
We sure are.
Oh, sorry. Was that not the answer?
what parents often misunderstand.
I mean, I can even say that I know where my folly is that I think that because I'm far removed from it, I minimize it. And I think like I'm saying like, okay, everybody's not doing that or that's stupid. So I don't know why you want to do that anyway. And minimizing the importance that those friends like have on my kid or on their identity. And so I think that minimizing and just acting like it doesn't matter. It's not that big of a deal. Just do the right thing.
Yeah.
And it's not always that simple.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think like the worldview of like a middle schooler, a high schooler is completely different than a parent. And so you having the bigger picture, like having gone through life, you're like, yeah, you're able to call that out as stupid or dumb. But for like the student, all that they know is like what their friends think of
Right.
them. And they're the ones that are like saying, oh, like this is good or you look good or you're performing good. And that's what's giving them their validation. And so I think like parents need to understand the bigger picture of like for a student, that is all that they know is like the validation that they're getting from outside sources.
Yeah.
Like it speaks louder,
Mhm.
which is
Totally.
crazy. But
Well, even going along with that, do you think there are things that parents can do to help create an environment where kids are able to kind of withstand peer pressure? You mentioned even being that voice of saying like, hey, you are uniquely you. And so hammering that home. Are there other things that we as parents could be saying or doing that could help create an environment where our kid either A, wants to talk to us about it? Because sometimes, if they're not sharing, you don't know, or even could approach it when they do share in a healthy way that encourages some growth.
I think the word that stands out to me is vulnerability. I think if you can be vulnerable as a parent, being able to share uh, maybe what you're going through now, but what you went through at that time, and whether it's probably not going to have to do with social media or it's going to be a different form of peer pressure. But I remember in different seasons of my life where my parents did that, or just mentors or friends that were older than me that shared with me those struggles that they dealt with in terms of whether it's peer pressure, whether it's in school and in relationships and all that. And so once I saw them, like their willingness to be vulnerable with me, it gave me an opportunity to do the same thing back.
Yeah.
And so I think as parents, it's a willingness to meet your kid eye to eye, and them not feel like they're just a little kid, but especially in my case, there's 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-year olds, like they're growing up, they're more mature. And so to be able to have conversations that are, a little bit more high level, a little bit more
Yeah.
mature, I think is something that would be very valuable.
Yeah.
Now, you both spoke about kind of experiencing pressure in different times of your life and in different seasons. Was there ever a time that your parents intervened? Like, if you were not with a great group of girls as friends, would your parents ever intervene and be like, we're just going to take over this and eliminate the peer pressure because we're going to cut off this relationship?
Mm. Yeah, there's definitely a time where my mom would voice like, "Hey, so and so, like I don't think she's a good influence on you," and I was able to recognize that. Um, but I think because of the pushback that I got, or maybe my mom trying to have more control over the situation, it kind of took me in the other direction of like wanting to like maybe go more wilder because of what she was telling me was so opposite of the tension that I was feeling. Um, and I think it created almost this environment where I always felt misunderstood, or maybe like,
Interesting. Yeah.
okay, like my mom is so set and like she thinks this way. Am I actually able to talk to her about it without getting like a huge reaction? Is often how I felt. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's hard even as a parent. Like I feel like I'm constantly like, okay, control your reaction here, like respond. But even some of the things you're saying about, we just keep coming back to friends and friends and friends. And I'm just wondering, maybe it's not that you can't be friends with them, but as they are growing up, encouraging like, hey, you want to invite so and so over, like creating a space for friends that are more healthy that you see. I don't, that feels like something that could be done in a healthy way without it being like, you may not hang out with someone, but hey, why don't we just like really encourage, different relationship?
Yeah.
That is really, really insightful, because I do feel like as a parent, you're trying so hard to have your kids avoid pain. And so my instinct is to try to step in. And if I can see Ezekiel going down a path that I know is going to end painfully, like I want to stop it. But if my intervening is going to drive him further down there, then I need to figure out another avenue to do that. I feel like we've talked about social media a couple different times already, but it just seems like social media is that path in so many different ways. And I think a way that I'm personally going to try to avoid that being the avenue of peer pressure is to just delay it for my kids as long as possible. I think it's so consuming, and there's so many different forms of it, and you can find your identity in so many different forms of it, that I want them to figure out who they are first before we go into the world wide web of who they could be or who they want to be. But I don't know. I think that it is a tough thing. And I think if your kids are already on social media, maybe figuring out different ways to limit it, because it is something that you can just spend time and time and time doing nothing, doom scrolling, doing whatever to stay kind of out of this reality.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I feel like we're going to have to limit the amount of noise that we keep talking about so that we're not constantly combating it. And so having healthy limits on social media and on all the things feels like
I have
good.
this dream that once my kids grow up, social media will just like not exist anymore.
It'll just like dissipate.
Yeah, because people will be like, "Oh, this wasn't actually good for us. Let's just like make it go."
That feels like what's happening. I have a question. What do you guys think of, there's this notion of like telling your kids like, hey, if you ever get in a situation, you can call me, no questions asked. I'll come pick you up. Or you've seen that we can just like text me like an ex or whatever it is, and I'll know to come, I'll call you and say like, you have to come home or something. Do you think those little practical, tangible of like ways for kids to get out of situations that maybe, they didn't realize they got into them and it's too late to be like, you shouldn't have been here. It's just like, okay, I'm here. Now what do I do? Do you feel like there's any validation in those kind of practical steps?
Yeah, I think so for sure. I mean, I think it shows the kid that, man, like my parent cares for me in a way that, hey, if I ever get into one of these situations, I know I can do this, or this, and they'll be right there for me. And I think, that just, yeah, it's just a deeper level of care and knowing that, okay, my parents, like, they're there, they're looking out for me, and if it comes up,
We're
great.
gonna be
Like
able.
I have a safety net.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
And I think it's on the parent too. Like in that type of situation, I think you've really got to prepare in the sense of like, you can't come down in this super disciplinarian once they reach out for help. Like you have to have a little bit of a plan of, obviously, there seems like we need to have a talk and figure out some consequences for whatever happened, but your kids aren't going to reach out if they feel like they're reaching out to
mm,
the lion's den because you're going to be so mad. I see, ironically, a post on social media all the time. Sorry about that. But it's always talking about, like, I want to be the mom that if something happens, that they're not thinking, like, oh my gosh, my mom's going to be so mad. I want to be the mom that, like, oh my gosh, something happened. I have to call my mom. Because I
Yeah.
think that's just such an important relationship to have and to have that, like, lifeline to them, especially in these scenarios.
I feel like, I just feel like we could do a whole episode on like the balance of as your kids get
Yeah.
older, where the discipline is and how
Yeah.
to create relationship within the bounds of limits. And we don't have time for that today, but that's a good topic. Remember that.
Okay. Put a pin in it.
Yeah.
Kaden and Alyssa, was there ever a time that you wanted to talk to an adult about peer pressure or something that you were experiencing and you didn't? And why?
mm. I Yes, there were definitely times, and I think for me, I was the youngest in my family, three older brothers. Parents are a little bit older, being the youngest, they had kids a little bit later. And so I just felt sometimes like the gap between their experiences and my experience were so wide. And I was like, is it really worth it to try to explain everything that, we talked about it earlier? Like, is it uh, worth it for me to put all the effort into explaining something and then for them to just still not really get where I'm at? Um, and so I think that goes both ways. Like, it takes me being willing as the kid to have those conversations still, even when it might be harder to explain what I'm going through, like whether it's something to do with social media or just something new that I'm experiencing that wasn't around when they were, or just in a different way. But also on their end or a real willingness to try to meet me and understand.
Yeah.
But I think that was probably the biggest thing for me that, would keep me from sharing. Is just like, is it worth it to spend all my time and then them just still not understand?
Understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think for me, it like got past the point of like a peer pressure conversation. And by the time I'd want to like reach out for help from like a parent or a mentor, it would be like on the other side of the consequence that I was
Mm,
facing because of the actions that I had done because of giving into peer pressure. And so I think by the time I got there, I was like, oh, I dug this hole, like realized I had made it and was like, I guess I'll just get myself out of it and felt stuck. Like, oh, I'm all the way at the end. Like it's too late for me to go back and ask for help, which wasn't true. But I think I kind of like created that reality for myself a lot of times.
Yeah. And so then even as parents, I'm like thinking as you're talking, like, okay, so
Mm-hmm.
like my role is to create a space so that if there's a situation that arises, if you want to explain something, if there is something that you've made a mistake, there is a space. And you're not trying to make space because I think that extra
Yeah.
effort is maybe
Yeah.
what stops
Mhm.
you. Yeah.
And I think like I even want to caution the parents who might be thinking, "Oh, like my daughter or my son, they would never." And
Oh,
so
no.
you're not having those conversations. Just like be proactive in starting those now so that there is that space where your daughter or son can look back and be like, "Oh, okay, I've talked about this before. Like I know that this is a safe space for me to talk about peer pressure or even on the other side of the consequence."
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good.
That's
My
really
mother-in-law, ever since my kids were little, always has said to me, if you ever become a parent that says my kid would never, you are like really in a danger zone. And so like always being prepared for, know what's going to happen. So
I think it's worth making note too of, I don't think that there's really ever a situation that like your kid is too far gone. So I think even in situations where it feels like mistake after mistake has happened, to still being able to greet them with that love and grace and know that they're not too far gone. And there are people out and resources out there that will help you kind of bring them back.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, like our primary role as parents is to point our kids to the gospel and point our kids to Christ. And so
Yeah.
filtering everything of identity and even the little things that, as a parent, I'm like, this is stupid. I'm like, no, no, no,
Yeah.
no. What is this saying
Yeah.
about where their heart is and where their heart should be? And just constantly, pointing back to the gospel. So do you guys have anything else just to add before we wrap up? We're really grateful for your time here.
I think, and maybe as a parent, you've already had these conversations of like when you do mess up and you have that feeling of like, oh, I've failed my child. Like, no, you have not.
Yeah.
And like, even just like me and my story is proof of that. Of like, I had that real conversation with my mom after graduating high school, of like, was met with the love of Jesus in a fresh way and was like, wow, the way I have been living, like I need to surrender it all. Like my life needs to do a complete 180. And like telling my mom like all the things that I had been hiding from her. And she was just, like in tears of like, I failed you as a parent. Like, where did I go wrong? And being like, hey, like this is never just on you. Like the Lord was writing my story the whole time. Yes, things probably could have been different, but like look at the way that I'm able to like now charge the next generation. Like it just has come full circle.
Yeah.
And so just encouragement to the parents. You're not failing and it's ultimately like in the Lord's hands. So just keep leaning and depending on him. Yeah.
No, I love that. And that's so important. And that's just a huge misstep that we can make in thinking that we have control over our kids' hearts and we don't. And so just laying it, before Jesus and saying, okay, Lord, we're going to be faithful in what you've given us, but having to trust that like he is writing all of our stories and he's writing our kids' stories. And it might not look exactly the way we would have written it, but it is the way that, he is in his perfect sovereign nature, the way it should be.
Well, Kanan and Alyssa, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time. It's been so great to get to know you guys better. And thanks for all that you do for the kids ministry and for middle school and high school. This has been Parenting for the Everyday. Tune in next time.